Hello, this is Mike with AskTractorMike.com. In my last video, I talked about 3 items that I think are kind of hype when you're shopping for a rotary cutter. 3 things that you really don't need to consider that much. And today I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think are really important when you're looking at a rotary cutter and trying to pick one out. Now here's a typical question I get from my viewers. They'll say, I'm looking at a Land Pride cutter or a Bush Hog cutter, a Rhino or Woods or any of the main brand Frontier cutter. Are they any good? And that is a really hard question to answer because most of the major suppliers make an entry-level cutter, a medium-duty cutter, and a heavy cutter. And within that line, there'll all be major differences. Now, if you took their light cutter out to the woods and tried to just knock down a whole bunch of brush, you'd probably tear it up. And so you might think that brand is not any good. So you trade that in on somebody else's brand that's the medium duty or heavy duty and go to the field and it never fails. And so you think that brand is better. So what I'm saying is it's difficult to say one brand is better than the other when they have different grades of cutters in each brand. So today we're going to talk about what to look for when buying a rotary cutter and what's important in your selection process. And the first thing that's important to look at is your tractor big enough to pull it? A lot of times horsepower is not the main factor here. So let's explain. Every cutter manufacturer will say this needs X amount of horsepower at the PTO, not engine horsepower, PTO horsepower to pull. And you need to watch that number and make sure your tractor is big enough. Now, horsepower is not all that dictates is your tractor big enough. If you have a 30-horse tractor and it's on a really small frame and you put a 6-foot cutter, it may lift the front end of that tractor up when you try to pick up the cutter. So we need to not only look at horsepower rating, but also the frame size of our tractor, and is there a front end loader on that tractor to counterbalance that weight out back. So that's the number one thing. Do I have a big enough tractor to pull the cutter I'm looking at? The number 2 thing that we need to look at is the gauge thickness in the sides and in the deck of the cutter. And the heavier gauge material has a lower number. So your impact points on a brush hog, the parts that wear out, are the sides around it and the top. And so we need to look at the gauge of metal on the sides and the top. Sometimes it's the same gauge, sometimes there'll be a little bit different gauge. And if you're comparing from one cutter to another in different brands, that gauge of material on the top deck and the sides is pretty important to look at. The next thing you can do to evaluate a rotary cutter, let's say you've looked at 2 cutters, they both fit your tractor, they both have the same gauge deck and sides. Which one is heavier built? Well, I just answered that question. Look at the weight. Everybody will publish their dry weight of their cutters. Is that an accurate look at how heavy the cutter is? Well, we could argue that. We don't know the quality of the metal in the cutter, but all things else being equal, I'd probably rather have one with 200 pounds more weight in it than one without. So looking at the overall weight of the cutter is important. The next thing to look at is, does it have a flat deck, and is that important to me? A lot of companies that wanted to get that deck where it was totally flat, where it doesn't accumulate material from the cutting process, put the bracing inside. In other words, there's a top of the deck and then bracing, and then below that is the bottom of the deck that actually is above the blades. So if you want a flat deck, the bracing is going to be inside, and that's important for you if you let wind and rain clean your cutter. Now, if you're like I am, and every time I use my cutter, I take a leaf blower and blow all the debris off of it so I don't have rust forming, then that really doesn't matter. But whether or not you have a flat deck or not is going to dictate how much material accumulates up there. And if you're not a person that does a lot of maintenance, you probably want a flat deck, and then most of that material will go away with wind when you're running it, and with rain after a time. So the deck bracing is another thing you want to look at. The last thing I would look at if I'm buying a cutter, and this is by far the most important, is what size material will it cut? And all cutters are rated on the size of material. The smaller cutters will cut up to 1 inch material. That's 1 inch across. Bigger cutters will cut up to 2 inches, maybe 3 inches. That's a medium-sized cutter. If you have a cutter that'll cut 4 to 6 inches, that's a heavy cutter. You need to figure out, what am I cutting? What's the biggest thing I'm going to cut? And don't scrimp here. If you're going to go back in the woods and try to knock down a 3-inch tree and you get a cutter that's rated for 1-inch material, I guarantee you'll tear it up and it won't be covered under warranty. So the size of material that it cuts, that's really the benchmark on all cutters. If you're looking at 5 cutters, make sure each one has the same size material that they'll cut, and you're comparing apples to apples. So those are the 5 things to look at when you're looking at a cutter. Next video, I'm going to talk about options on a cutter, and there's not too many, but there's some that are kind of important, and I've been getting some questions about them. We'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you for watching my videos. I'd be honored if you'd share this video with other tractor enthusiasts and subscribe to my YouTube channel and like my Facebook page. And if you have questions or comments, put them down below. We'll try to get back with you. Thanks for watching.